Hi Guy, do you know Hitler? Adolf Hitler's legacy as one of history's most infamous figures is inextricably tied to his role as the primary instigator of World War II, a conflict that reshaped the global order and left an indelible mark on humanity. From his rise to power in 1933 as Chancellor of Germany to his death in 1945, Hitler's aggressive policies and ideological fanaticism plunged the world into a war that claimed over 50 million lives, devastated continents, and altered geopolitical landscapes. His decision to invade Poland on the 1st of September 1939 triggered a chain reaction that drew nations into a catastrophic struggle, cementing his image as a symbol of destructive leadership. Over 2,000 years of storytelling, from epic myths to modern histories, narratives have chronicled figures who reshaped their eras through ambition and hubris. Hitler's role in World War II, however, stands out for its unprecedented scale and consequences, laying the foundation for both historical truths and the myths that amplify his profound global impact. Hitler's initiation of World War II was rooted in his ideological vision, articulated in Mein Kampf 1925, which blended ultranationalism, anti-Semitism, and the concept of Lebensraum, the pursuit of living space for the Aryan race. This vision drove Nazi Germany's expansionist policies, beginning with the reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936 in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, and continuing with the annexation of Austria, Anschluss, in 1938, and the Sudetenland via the Munich Agreement. These early aggressions, met with appeasement from Britain and France, emboldened Hitler, culminating in the invasion of Poland, which prompted France and the United Kingdom to declare war. The rapid conquests that followed Denmark, Norway, France, and the Low Countries in 1940 demonstrated the devastating efficacy of Hitler's blitzkrieg tactics, spreading fear and destruction across Europe. The war's global escalation, driven by Hitler's ambitions, marked a turning point in modern history. His 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, violated the Nazi-Soviet pact and opened a brutal Eastern Front, leading to millions of deaths and unimaginable suffering. The attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan, Germany's ally, in December 1941 drew the United States into the conflict, transforming the war into a truly global struggle. Hitler's strategic overreach, from underestimating Soviet resilience to declaring war on the US, exposed the flaws in his vision of a thousand-year Reich. By 1945, Germany's defeat marked by the fall of Berlin and Hitler's suicide ended the European theater, but the war's toll was staggering. Entire cities reduced to rubble, economies shattered, and populations displaced. The consequences of Hitler's actions in World War II reshaped the global order in ways that continue to reverberate. The war accelerated the decline of European colonial empires as Britain and France, weakened by the conflict, faced growing independence movements in Asia and Africa. The emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers ushered in the Cold War, a decades-long ideological struggle that defined the 20th century. The establishment of the United Nations in 1945, aimed at preventing future global conflicts, was a direct response to the war's devastation, reflecting Hitler's unintended influence on international cooperation. These geopolitical shifts, from decolonization to bipolar global power dynamics, trace their origins to the chaos unleashed by Hitler's aggression, underscoring his role as a historical catalyst. The scale of World War II's destruction cemented Hitler's legacy as a figure of catastrophic leadership, a narrative amplified by both historical accounts and mythic distortions. In mainstream history, he is portrayed as a megalomaniacal dictator whose obsession with racial purity and territorial conquest led to unparalleled suffering. This portrayal draws on ancient archetypes, such as the tragic hero whose hubris invites downfall, seen in myths like Icarus or the tyrannical kings of Greek drama. Yet, in extremist circles, myths of Hitler as a misunderstood visionary or a defender of national pride persist, fueled by selective reinterpretations of his early economic successes or propaganda's enduring echo. These legends, though fringe, highlight the war's role in creating a dual narrative: Hitler as both the ultimate villain and a figure of fascination. Psychologically, the war's horrors, driven by Hitler's ideology, forced humanity to confront the capacity for collective destruction. The bombing of civilians, from London to Dresden, and the brutal campaigns on the Eastern Front revealed the depths of industrialized warfare, a legacy that haunts modern conflicts. Philosophically, the war prompted existential questions about human nature, echoing ancient Stoic reflections on reason versus passion or Socratic inquiries into moral responsibility. Thinkers like Hannah Arendt later grappled with these issues, analyzing how ordinary individuals enabled Hitler's atrocities, a theme explored in her concept of the banality of evil. The war's moral and psychological impact thus extends beyond its immediate toll, shaping global consciousness about power and accountability. Culturally, World War II, as Hitler's most tangible legacy, became a touchstone for storytelling, from literature to film. Works like Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers depict the war's heroism and horror, reinforcing Hitler's image as the architect of chaos. These narratives draw on a 2,000-year-old tradition of epic tales, such as the Iliad, where leaders' decisions ripple across civilizations. The war's cultural legacy also includes the valorization of the Allied victory, mythologized as a triumph of democracy over tyranny, though this narrative oversimplifies the complex motivations of all parties involved. Hitler's role as the war's instigator ensures his place in these stories, perpetuating his impact through collective memory. The war's historical significance lies not only in its immediate outcomes, but also in its role as the foundation for Hitler's enduring myths. The sheer scale of the conflict spanning continents, involving millions and redefining global power, created a narrative vacuum filled by both truth and distortion. Mainstream histories document Hitler's failures, from strategic blunders to ideological fanaticism, yet myths of his invincibility or survival, for example, conspiracies about his escape to Argentina, reflect humanity's need to grapple with his larger-than-life persona. These legends, rooted in the war's chaos, parallel ancient myths of gods or monsters whose actions reshape the world, underscoring why Hitler's legacy remains so potent. Ultimately, Hitler's role in World War II was the historical catalyst that defined his profound impact on the world. By initiating a conflict of unprecedented scale, he altered geopolitical, cultural, and moral landscapes, from the rise of superpowers to the reckoning with human rights. His actions laid the groundwork for both the historical truth of his destructive leadership and the myths that amplify his legacy, from villainous archetype to extremist icon. As a figure whose decisions reshaped the 20th century, Hitler's war connects to a 2,000-year-old tradition of storytelling about power and its consequences, urging us to understand history's lessons to prevent such catastrophes in the future. The Holocaust, orchestrated under Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime from 1941 to 1945, stands as one of the most harrowing chapters in human history, profoundly shaping Hitler's global legacy as a symbol of unparalleled evil. The systematic genocide of 6 million Jews, alongside millions of Romani people, disabled individuals, political dissidents, homosexuals, and others, marked a moral abyss that continues to haunt collective memory. Driven by Hitler's virulent anti-Semitic ideology, as outlined in Mein Kampf and enacted through the Final Solution, the Holocaust's scale and brutality set it apart from prior atrocities, cementing Hitler's image as the architect of unimaginable horror. Over 2,000 years, from ancient tales of tyranny to modern narratives of moral failure, the Holocaust's legacy amplifies Hitler's impact, fueling both historical truths and mythic distortions, while shaping global commitments to human rights and remembrance. The Holocaust's origins lie in the Nazi regime's racial ideology, which deemed Jews an existential threat to the Aryan master race. Hitler's anti-Semitism, rooted in centuries-old European prejudices but radicalized by his worldview, escalated from discriminatory laws like the 1935 Nuremberg Laws to mass violence. The 1938 Kristallnacht pogrom foreshadowed the genocide, while the invasion of Poland in 1939 and the Soviet Union in 1941 provided the logistical framework for mass murder. Einsatzgruppen death squads executed over 1 million Jews in Eastern Europe, but the 1942 Wannsee Conference formalized the final solution, establishing extermination camps like Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor. These camps, equipped with gas chambers and crematoria, industrialized genocide, killing millions with chilling efficiency. By 1945, when Allied forces liberated the camps, the world confronted images of emaciated survivors and mass graves, revealing the Holocaust's unimaginable scale. The Holocaust's immediate impact was a global moral reckoning. The sheer number of victims, approximately 6 million Jews, and up to 5 million others, defied comprehension, while survivor accounts, such as Elie Wiesel's night and Primo Levi's survival in Auschwitz, bore witness to the dehumanization endured. The 1946 Nuremberg trials exposed Nazi leaders' complicity, with figures like Hermann Göring and Rudolf Höss detailing the genocide's machinery. These trials, broadcast globally, solidified Hitler's legacy as the mastermind of atrocity, even in absentia following his suicide. The Holocaust's exposure prompted the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 1948 Genocide Convention, reflecting a global resolve to prevent such horrors. These legal frameworks, born from the ashes of Hitler's crimes, underscore his unintended influence on modern human rights discourse. Culturally, the Holocaust became a touchstone for exploring human evil, amplifying Hitler's mythic status. Literature, film, and art. From Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl to Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List, depict the genocide's tragedy, portraying Hitler as the archetype of malevolent leadership. These narratives draw on a 2,000-year-old storytelling tradition, echoing myths like the tyrannical Cronus devouring his children, where unchecked power leads to destruction. Yet, the Holocaust also spawned darker myths, with denialists falsely claiming the genocide was exaggerated or fabricated, perpetuating anti-Semitic conspiracies. These distortions, rooted in the same prejudices Hitler exploited, highlight the Holocaust's role in sustaining his legacy as both a historical villain and a figure of extremist fascination, necessitating ongoing efforts to preserve truth through education and memorials. Psychologically, the Holocaust forces humanity to confront the capacity for collective cruelty. Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem introduced the banality of evil, suggesting that ordinary individuals, like Adolf Eichmann, enabled genocide through bureaucratic obedience. This insight challenges simplistic views of Hitler as a singular monster, implicating societal complicity in his crimes. The psychological shock of the Holocaust resonates with ancient philosophical questions, such as Plato's inquiry into justice in the Republic or the Stoic emphasis on moral resilience against tyranny. The genocide scale executed not by a lone madman but by thousands following Orders Prompt's introspection about conformity and moral failure, a legacy that informs modern studies of groupthink and authoritarianism. Philosophically, the Holocaust raises existential questions about human nature and morality, echoing debates spanning 2,000 years. Existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre, writing in the war's aftermath, grappled with freedom and responsibility, questioning how societies permitted such atrocities. The genocide's deliberate targeting of entire groups challenges Enlightenment, ideals of progress, recalling Hobbes' view of human nature as prone to conflict absent strong governance. Hitler's role as the ideological driver of this moral collapse positions him as a cautionary figure against absolutist ideologies. A lesson rooted in Socratic calls for critical inquiry. The Holocaust's philosophical legacy thus fuels ongoing discussions about ethics, power, and the fragility of civilization. The Holocaust's global impact extends beyond its immediate aftermath, shaping modern commitments to remembrance and prevention. Institutions like Yad Vashem in Israel and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum preserve survivor testimonies and artifacts, ensuring the genocide's reality is not forgotten. Annual commemorations, such as International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the 27th of January, reinforce global solidarity against hatred. These efforts counter Holocaust denial and neo-Nazi myths, which falsely reframe Hitler as a misunderstood leader, highlighting the tension between historical truth and distortion. The genocide's legacy also informs responses to later atrocities, from Rwanda to Bosnia, though challenges in preventing genocide underscore the difficulty of applying Hitler's lessons universally. Socially, the Holocaust redefined discussions of identity and tolerance. The persecution of Jews, Romani, and others exposed the dangers of scapegoating minorities, prompting post-war movements for civil rights and inclusion. In Europe, the genocide's memory fueled the European Union's formation, aiming to unify nations against nationalism's destructive potential. Yet, the persistence of anti-Semitism and xenophobia, often invoking Hitler's rhetoric, reveals the Holocaust's unfinished lessons. This duality progress toward equality juxtaposed with resurgent hate underscores Hitler's enduring impact as a symbol of both humanity's lowest depths and its aspirations for redemption. Ultimately, the Holocaust is a cornerstone of Hitler's profound global legacy, encapsulating the horror of his ideology and the resilience of those who survived. Its scale and brutality, driven by Hitler's vision, set it apart as a moral and historical watershed, influencing human rights, cultural narratives, and philosophical inquiry. The genocide connects to a 2,000-year-old tradition of grappling with tyranny and moral failure, from ancient myths to modern reflections on evil. As a legacy of unimaginable atrocity, the Holocaust fuels both the historical truth of Hitler's crimes and the myths that distort them, urging humanity to remember, reflect, and act to prevent such darkness from rising again. Its lessons, rooted in the ashes of Auschwitz, remain a clarion call for vigilance in a world still grappling with hatred and division. Adolf Hitler's ascent from an obscure Austrian drifter to the dictator of Nazi Germany by 1933 is a chilling case study in the power of populism and the fragility of democratic institutions, contributing significantly to his profound global impact. Exploiting the economic, social, and political turmoil of Weimar Germany, Hitler transformed the fledgling Nazi Party into a mass movement, seizing power through democratic means before dismantling democracy itself. His rise, fueled by charismatic oratory, propaganda, and scapegoating, resonates as a timeless warning about how demagogues exploit societal vulnerabilities to gain unchecked power. Over 2,000 years, from ancient tyrants to modern populists, narratives have cautioned against leaders who manipulate fear and division, and Hitler's story stands as a stark exemplar, shaping both historical understanding and myths that amplify his legacy as a cautionary figure. The historical context of Hitler's rise was a perfect storm of crises in post-World War I Germany. The 1919 Treaty of Versailles, which ended the war, imposed harsh reparations, territorial losses, and a war guilt clause, fostering widespread resentment among Germans. The Weimar Republic, established in 1919, struggled with political instability, facing revolts from both communists and right-wing nationalists. The 1923 hyperinflation crisis wiped out savings, while the Great Depression, beginning in 1929, pushed unemployment to over 6 million by 1932. This economic despair, coupled with national humiliation, created fertile ground for Hitler's message. Joining the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi Party, in 1919, Hitler quickly rose to leadership, capitalizing on these grievances with promises of restoring Germany's greatness, articulated in his 1925 manifesto, Mein Kampf. Hitler's populist strategy hinged on exploiting division and fear. His fiery speeches, delivered at mass rallies, blended ultranationalism, anti-Semitism, and anti-communism, scapegoating Jews, Marxists, and Versailles negotiators for Germany's woes. This rhetoric tapped into deep-seated prejudices, portraying Jews as a conspiratorial threat to national unity, a trope rooted in centuries-old European anti-Semitism but radicalized by Hitler's ideology. His charisma, amplified by propaganda mastermind Joseph Goebbels, created a cult of personality, casting Hitler as the Führer messianic savior destined to lead Germany to glory. The Nazi Party's brown-shirted SA, Sturmabteilung, intimidated opponents, while carefully staged events, like the 1927 Nuremberg rallies, projected strength and unity, drawing thousands to the cause. The democratic collapse that enabled Hitler's rise underscores the fragility of institutions under populist pressure. In the 1932 elections, the Nazi Party became the largest in the Reichstag, securing 37% of the vote, though never a majority. Political gridlock and fear of communism led conservative elites, including President Paul von Hindenburg, to appoint Hitler as Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933, believing they could control him. Within months, Hitler consolidated power through the March 1933 Enabling Act, which allowed his government to enact laws without parliamentary approval, effectively ending democracy. The Reichstag fire in February 1933, blamed on communists, provided a pretext to suppress opposition, while the Night of the Long Knives in 1934 eliminated internal rivals. By 1934, Hitler was absolute ruler, a trajectory that warns of democracy's vulnerability to manipulation. Psychologically, Hitler's appeal reflects the human susceptibility to charismatic leadership during crises. His ability to channel collective anger and despair aligns with Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, where archetypes like the savior figure resonate in times of uncertainty. The German populace, reeling from economic collapse and national shame, projected their hopes onto Hitler, ignoring his radical ideology. This dynamic echoes ancient warnings, such as Plato's critique in the Republic of Democracy's tendency to devolve into tyranny when unchecked passion overrides reason. The psychological allure of Hitler's populism, promising simple solutions to complex problems, explains his rapid rise and informs modern studies of authoritarian movements, from cults to political extremism. Philosophically, Hitler's ascent raises questions about power, morality, and societal responsibility, connecting to a 2,000-year tradition of ethical inquiry. Aristotle's Politics warns that demagogues exploit public discontent to seize power, a pattern Hitler exemplified by manipulating democratic processes. Stoic philosophers like Seneca emphasized rational self-governance to resist tyranny, a principle absent in the Weimar public's embrace of Hitler's emotional rhetoric. Post-war thinkers like Hannah Arendt later analyzed how fear and propaganda erode moral agency, enabling figures like Hitler to thrive. His rise thus serves as a philosophical caution against surrendering reason to populist fervor, urging societies to uphold critical thinking and civic duty. Culturally, Hitler's rise became a narrative archetype for the dangers of populism, amplified by both historical accounts and myths. Mainstream histories, such as Ian Kershaw's Hitler, a biography, depict him as an opportunist who exploited systemic weaknesses, while myths among neo-Nazis falsely portray him as a heroic savior restoring national pride. These distortions, rooted in the propaganda of his early successes, like reducing unemployment through public works, persist in extremist circles, highlighting the tension between truth and legend. The story of his rise, like ancient tales of tyrants such as Nero or Caligula, serves as a cultural warning embedded in literature and film, from Bertolt Brecht's The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui to documentaries like The Nazis, a warning from history. The global impact of Hitler's rise lies in its lessons for democratic resilience. His ability to gain power legally, then dismantle democracy, prompted post-war reforms, such as Germany's Basic Law, designed to prevent authoritarianism. Internationally, his example informs debates about populism's rise, from interwar fascism to modern movements exploiting economic or cultural discontent. The Weimar collapse, driven by division and mistrust, mirrors contemporary challenges like polarization and disinformation, making Hitler's story a timeless case study. His legacy as a populist cautionary tale underscores the need for robust institutions, civic engagement, and vigilance against divisive rhetoric. Ultimately, Hitler's rise to power is a cornerstone of his profound global impact, illustrating how populism can exploit societal fractures to catastrophic ends. His manipulation of Weimar Germany's crises, enabled by charisma, propaganda, and democratic weaknesses, connects to a 2,000-year tradition of warning against tyrannical ambition. From Greek philosophy to modern political theory, the historical truth of his opportunism contrasts with myths of his savior status, fueling ongoing debates about power and responsibility. As a cautionary tale, Hitler's ascent urges societies to guard against demagogues, fostering resilience to ensure that such a rise does not recur in the forests of modern discontent. Adolf Hitler's enduring global impact owes much to the Nazi regime's sophisticated propaganda machine, which crafted a mythic image of him as the Führer, near-divine leader destined to restore Germany's greatness. From 1933 to 1945, under the direction of figures like Joseph Goebbels, Nazi propaganda leveraged media, art, and iconography to manipulate public perception, creating a cult of personality that transcended reality. This deliberate myth-making, through films, rallies, newspapers, and symbols like the swastika, not only consolidated Hitler's power during his lifetime, but also shaped his posthumous legacy, fueling both vilification and fascination. Over 2,000 years, from ancient rulers' divine imagery to modern media manipulation, propaganda has amplified leaders' myths, and Hitler's case stands as a chilling exemplar, underscoring why his legend persists in historical truth and distorted narratives. The Nazi propaganda machine was a cornerstone of Hitler's regime, orchestrated by Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda. Goebbels understood the power of mass media in an era of radio, print, and cinema, using these tools to saturate German society with Nazi ideology. The Völkischer Beobachter, the Nazi Party's official newspaper, portrayed Hitler as a visionary savior, while radio broadcasts carried his speeches to millions, amplifying his charismatic oratory. Films like Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, 1935, documenting the 1934 Nuremberg Rally, presented Hitler as a godlike figure, framed against dramatic skies and adoring crowds. These efforts created a unified narrative, casting Hitler as the embodiment of Germany's destiny, a myth that resonated with a populace desperate for hope amid economic and social turmoil. Iconography played a central role in this myth-making. The swastika, repurposed from ancient symbols, became a ubiquitous emblem of Nazi power, adorning flags, uniforms, and public spaces. Its stark geometry and red-black-white color scheme evoked primal emotions, embedding itself in collective memory. Hitler's personal image, carefully staged with his distinctive mustache, intense gaze, and military attire, was equally iconic, designed to project strength and authority. Mass rallies, such as those at Nuremberg, were choreographed spectacles, with thousands of uniformed supporters, torchlit processions, and grandiose architecture, creating an aura of invincibility. These visual elements, meticulously crafted, transformed Hitler into a larger-than-life figure, a myth that persists in both condemnation and extremist reverence. Psychologically, Nazi propaganda exploited human vulnerabilities, aligning with ancient insights into collective behavior. The rally's mass hysteria recalls Plato's warnings in the Republic about the dangers of emotional manipulation in crowds, where reason yields to passion. Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious helps explain Hitler's appeal as an archetypal leader, embodying the savior figure in a time of crisis. Propaganda's repetition of simple slogans like Ein Volk, Ein Reich, Ein Führer, one people, one nation, one leader, created a sense of unity and purpose, drowning out dissent. This psychological manipulation, which turned ordinary citizens into fervent supporters, underscores why Hitler's mythic image endured, as it tapped into universal human desires for belonging and certainty. Culturally, the propaganda machine drew on a 2,000-year tradition of myth-making by rulers. Ancient leaders like Alexander the Great or Roman emperors used coins, statues, and epic poems to craft divine personas, much as Hitler used modern media. The Nazis' appropriation of Germanic folklore, Wagnerian opera, and pseudo-historical narratives about Aryan supremacy created a cultural framework that glorified Hitler as a modern Odin leading his people to a mythic destiny. Post-war, This imagery fueled contrasting legends. Mainstream narratives, such as in Schindler's List, depict Hitler as a monstrous tyrant, while extremist myths, perpetuated by neo-Nazis, falsely reframe him as a tragic hero. The propaganda's cultural legacy thus sustains Hitler's dual image, a testament to its enduring power. Philosophically, Nazi propaganda raises questions about truth, power, and moral responsibility, echoing ancient and modern debates. Socrates' emphasis on critical inquiry, as recorded by Plato, stands in stark contrast to the Nazis' suppression of dissent through propaganda, highlighting the dangers of unchallenged narratives. Nietzsche's concept of the will to power, misused by the Nazis, underscores how propaganda can distort philosophical ideas to justify tyranny. Post-war thinkers like George Orwell, in 1984, explored propaganda's ability to rewrite reality, a phenomenon rooted in Nazi techniques like the Big Lie. The philosophical legacy of Hitler's propaganda thus warns against the erosion of truth, urging societies to foster skepticism and ethical vigilance. The global impact of Nazi propaganda lies in its role in amplifying Hitler's legacy beyond his lifetime. During the Third Reich, it enabled the Holocaust and World War II by dehumanizing Jews and rallying support for aggression, as seen in anti-Semitic films like The Eternal Jew. After 1945, the propaganda's imagery became a cultural shorthand for evil, with swastikas and Hitler's likeness evoking instant recognition in media worldwide. Yet, this same imagery fuels neo-Nazi movements, where propaganda artifacts posters, speeches, and symbols are repurposed to spread hate. The persistence of conspiracy theories, such as Hitler's supposed survival in South America, reflects the propaganda's mythic residue, blending fact with fiction in ways that complicate historical memory. Socially, the propaganda machine's legacy informs modern efforts to combat misinformation. The Nazis' use of radio and film prefigures today's digital propaganda, from state-controlled media to online extremist content. The spread of fake news and algorithmic echo chambers mirrors Goebbels' strategy of controlling narratives, making Hitler's propaganda a cautionary case study. Counter-efforts, such as media literacy programs and laws banning Nazi symbols in Germany, aim to dismantle this legacy, but the swastika's occasional reappearance in hate crimes shows its enduring potency. The propaganda's social impact thus underscores the need for vigilance in an information-saturated world. The myth-making machine's success lies in its ability to create a narrative that outlived Hitler, shaping his legacy as both a historical villain and a figure of extremist allure. The propaganda's deliberate construction of the Führer myth, rooted in ancient traditions of deifying leaders, ensured Hitler's image transcended his failures. While historical accounts, grounded in evidence like Goebbels' diaries or Riefenstahl's films, reveal the manipulation behind the myth, extremist narratives cling to the propaganda's fabricated heroism, perpetuating division. This duality connects to a 2,000-year-old storytelling tradition, from divine pharaohs to modern icons, where myths amplify power's impact. Ultimately, Nazi propaganda and iconography were pivotal in cementing Hitler's profound global legacy, transforming him into a mythic figure whose image evokes both horror and fascination. By leveraging media, symbols, and mass psychology, the regime crafted a narrative that enabled atrocities and reshaped cultural memory. The propaganda's legacy, from its role in the Holocaust to its influence on modern misinformation, warns of the dangers of unchecked narratives, echoing ancient philosophical calls for truth and reason. As we navigate a world of digital myths, Hitler's propaganda machine remains a stark reminder to critically examine the stories that shape our reality. Adolf Hitler's profound global impact is perpetuated and amplified through his portrayal in literature, film, television, and other media, which have shaped how the world perceives his legacy as a symbol of evil and a cautionary figure. From the immediate aftermath of World War II to contemporary works, cultural representations of Hitler and the Nazi regime range from harrowing historical accounts to satirical critiques, embedding his image in collective memory. These narratives, drawing on a 2,000-year tradition of storytelling about tyrants and moral failure, oscillate between demonizing Hitler as the architect of atrocities and humanizing the broader context of his era to warn against repeating history. By keeping Hitler's legacy alive in global consciousness, these representations contribute to both historical understanding and the myths that surround him, underscoring their role in his enduring influence. Literature has been a primary medium for grappling with Hitler's legacy, offering intimate and philosophical perspectives on the horrors of Nazism. Anne Frank's The Diary of a Young Girl, 1947, written during her hiding from Nazi persecution, humanizes the Holocaust's victims, indirectly framing Hitler as the unseen force behind their suffering. Elie Wiesel's Night, 1960, provides a visceral account of Auschwitz, portraying Hitler's ideology as a moral abyss. Fictional works like George Orwell's 1984, 1949 draw parallels to Nazi totalitarianism, with Big Brother echoing Hitler's cult of personality. More speculative narratives, such as Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle, 1962, imagine alternate histories where Hitler's regime triumphs, exploring the fragility of freedom. These works, rooted in ancient storytelling traditions, like the Greek tragedies that depict tyrannical hubris, cement Hitler as a literary archetype of evil while probing the societal failures that enabled him. Film has been equally instrumental in shaping Hitler's cultural image, leveraging visual storytelling to reach global audiences. Early wartime propaganda, like Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator, 1940, used satire to mock Hitler's persona, portraying him as the buffoonish adenoid Hinkel while critiquing his ideology. Post-war films like Judgment at Nuremberg, 1961, depicted the legal reckoning of Nazi crimes, reinforcing Hitler's role as the genocide's mastermind. Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List, 1993, brought the Holocaust's horrors to vivid life, using stark imagery to evoke moral outrage against Hitler's policies. More recent films, like Downfall, 2004, humanize Hitler's final days in Berlin, sparking debates about whether such portrayals risk normalizing evil. These cinematic narratives draw on epic traditions, like the Iliad's portrayal of flawed leaders, to explore power's consequences, ensuring Hitler's legacy remains a cultural touchstone. Television and theater have further diversified Hitler's representations, often blending education with entertainment. Series like Band of Brothers, 2001, and The World at War, 1973, document the Allied fight against Hitler's regime, framing him as a formidable yet ultimately defeated adversary. Comedic approaches, such as Mel Brooks's The Producers, 1967, or Taika Waititi's Jojo Rabbit, 2019, use absurdity to deflate Hitler's mythic aura, portraying him as a caricature to highlight Nazism's ridiculousness. Theatre productions, like Bertolt Brecht's The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui, 1941, draw parallels between Hitler's rise and gangsterism, warning of populist dangers. These varied formats, echoing ancient comedic and dramatic traditions, keep Hitler's legacy accessible, reinforcing his dual image as a historical villain and a cautionary symbol. Psychologically, cultural representations of Hitler tap into humanity's fascination with evil, a theme explored in Section 6. Jung's concept of the shadow archetype explains why Hitler's image captivates, embodying society's darker impulses. By portraying him as both monstrous and human, media allows audiences to confront their own moral boundaries. This duality mirrors ancient philosophical inquiries, such as Plato's exploration of justice in The Republic, where tyrants represent reason's failure. Representations that humanize Hitler, like Downfall's depiction of his paranoia, risk empathy but aim to demystify his power, showing him as a flawed individual rather than a supernatural force. This psychological engagement ensures Hitler's legacy endures, as audiences grapple with the question of how such evil arose. Philosophically, these representations raise questions about memory, morality, and the ethics of portrayal, connecting to a 2,000-year tradition of ethical debate. Socrates' call for self-examination contrasts with Nazi propaganda's manipulation, suggesting media's role in fostering critical reflection. Post-war thinkers like Theodor Adorno warned against aestheticizing atrocities, a concern echoed in debates over films that dramatize the Holocaust. The ethical tension of depicting Hitler, whether as caricature, monster, or human, reflects existentialist concerns, like Sartre's emphasis on responsibility in shaping narratives. By engaging these questions, cultural representations of Hitler contribute to philosophical discourse, urging societies to confront history's lessons without trivializing its horrors. Culturally, these works sustain Hitler's legacy by embedding him in global narratives, often at the cost of amplifying myths. Mainstream media reinforces his image as the epitome of evil, a narrative rooted in historical truth but simplified for dramatic effect. Conversely, extremist myths, perpetuated in fringe media, falsely portray Hitler as a misunderstood leader, drawing on Nazi propaganda's residue. This tension parallels ancient myths, where figures like Nero were both vilified and romanticized. The swastika's recurring appearance in media, even in condemnation, risks desensitization, while satirical portrayals, like in Jojo Rabbit, aim to reclaim narrative control but can be misinterpreted. These cultural dynamics highlight media's role in shaping Hitler's dual legacy, necessitating careful stewardship of historical memory. Globally, cultural representations have influenced how societies process Hitler's impact, from education to policy. Holocaust films and literature are used in classrooms worldwide, fostering awareness of genocide's consequences and informing human rights advocacy. The global reach of works like Schindler's List has spurred memorials, such as Yad Vashem, and commemorations like International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Yet, the proliferation of Hitler's image in popular culture, from memes to video games, risks trivializing his crimes, echoing Adorno's concerns about commodifying suffering. This global impact underscores media's power to both educate and distort, making Hitler's legacy a case study in responsible storytelling. Ultimately, cultural representations of Hitler in literature and media are a cornerstone of his profound global impact, perpetuating his image as a symbol of evil while warning against history's repetition. By drawing on a 2,000-year tradition of storytelling, from Greek tragedy to modern satire, these works explore power, morality, and human failure, embedding Hitler in collective memory. The tension between historical truth and mythic distortion monstrous villain versus humanized figure fuels ongoing debates about how to portray evil. As media continues to shape perceptions of Hitler, from classrooms to cinemas, It urges us to confront his legacy with critical awareness, ensuring its lessons endure in a world still grappling with division and intolerance. Adolf Hitler's enduring global impact is deeply tied to the psychological fascination his persona evokes, captivating the human psyche as a symbol of evil and a paradox of charisma and cruelty. The scale of his atrocities, World War II's devastation, and the Holocaust's genocide, combined with his ability to galvanize millions, creates a compelling enigma that draws scholars, artists, and the public to probe the nature of evil. This fascination, rooted in psychological theories about human behavior and collective complicity, amplifies Hitler's legacy, sustaining both historical scrutiny and mythic distortions. Over 2,000 years, from ancient myths of monstrous tyrants to modern explorations of morality, humanity has sought to understand its darker impulses, and Hitler's story serves as a chilling lens, illuminating why his impact remains so profound. Psychologically, Hitler's allure can be understood through Carl Jung's concept of the shadow archetype, representing the repressed, darker aspects of the human psyche. Hitler embodies this shadow on a grand scale, his ruthless ambition and anti-Semitic fanaticism reflecting humanity's capacity for destruction. His charisma, evident in his electrifying speeches and cult-like following, juxtaposes this darkness, creating a paradox that fascinates. Jung argued that confronting the shadow is essential for self-awareness, and Hitler's image forces societies to face their own potential for evil. This psychological tension explains why his persona captivates, from documentaries dissecting his rise to fictional portrayals like Downfall, 2004, which humanizes his final days, prompting viewers to grapple with his humanity and monstrosity. The concept of the banality of evil, introduced by Hannah Arendt in Eichmann in Jerusalem, 1963, further deepens this fascination. Observing Adolf Eichmann's trial, Arendt noted that his role in the Holocaust stemmed not from diabolical intent, but from bureaucratic obedience, suggesting that ordinary people can enable extraordinary evil. Hitler, as the ideological driver of this system, becomes a focal point for exploring how charismatic leadership exploits such compliance. This insight resonates with ancient philosophical warnings, such as Plato's critique in The Republic of unchecked power corrupting both leaders and followers. The psychological shock of realizing that millions supported or acquiesced to Hitler's regime fuels ongoing interest, as societies seek to understand the mechanisms of collective moral failure. Hitler's ability to inspire mass devotion also taps into the psychology of group dynamics and the need for belonging. Social identity theory, developed by Henry Tajfel, explains how individuals derive self-esteem from group membership, making them susceptible to leaders who promise unity and purpose. In Weimar Germany's chaos, Hitler's propaganda offered a sense of Volk, peoplehood, scapegoating Jews and others to unify followers against a common enemy. This dynamic, seen in his Nuremberg rally's mass hysteria, mirrors ancient rituals where communities rallied around charismatic figures, from Roman emperors to mythic heroes like Achilles. The psychological allure of belonging to a greater cause explains why Hitler's movement gained traction and why his legacy fascinates, as it reveals humanity's vulnerability to tribalism. Culturally, the fascination with Hitler reflects a broader human obsession with evil, amplified by his portrayal in media, as discussed in Section 5. True crime narratives, from medieval tales of outlaws to modern serial killer documentaries, parallel the public's interest in Hitler, who represents evil on an unprecedented scale. Films like Schindler's List, 1993, and books like Elie Wiesel's Night evoke horror at his crimes, while satirical works like Jojo Rabbit, 2019, use humor to probe the absurdity of his ideology. These representations, rooted in a 2,000-year storytelling tradition of confronting malevolence, from the monstrous Grendel in Beowulf to Milton's Satan in Paradise Lost, keep Hitler's image alive, feeding both historical understanding and myths that exaggerate his power or charisma. Philosophically, the fascination with Hitler raises questions about morality, free will, and human nature, connecting to ancient and modern debates. Socrates' call for self-examination, as recorded by Plato, urges individuals to question their actions, a principle violated by the millions who followed Hitler. Existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre, writing post-war, emphasized personal responsibility in the face of absurd evil, suggesting that complicity in Nazism stemmed from a refusal to confront moral choices. Nietzsche's concept of the will to power, though misused by Nazis, frames Hitler's ambition as a distorted drive for dominance, prompting reflection on power's ethical limits. This philosophical inquiry, spanning 2,000 years, underscores why Hitler's evil captivates, as it challenges assumptions about human goodness and agency. The psychological impact of Hitler's legacy extends to collective guilt and trauma, particularly in Germany and among Holocaust survivors' descendants. Germany's post-war Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, reflects a national reckoning with complicity, evident in memorials like Berlin's Holocaust Memorial. Psychologically, this process aligns with Freud's concept of working through trauma, where confronting painful memories fosters healing. Globally, the Holocaust's trauma fuels fascination with Hitler, as societies seek to understand how such atrocities occurred to prevent recurrence. Yet, this fascination risks distortion, with myths of Hitler's genius or survival conspiracies, for example, escaping to Argentina, arising from a need to rationalize his impact, complicating historical truth. Socially, the fascination with evil informs efforts to combat extremism, as Hitler's psychological appeal serves as a case study. The allure of charismatic leaders persists in modern authoritarian movements, from political populists to cult leaders, echoing Hitler's tactics of division and promises of salvation. Psychological research, such as Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, highlights how authority can override moral judgment, a dynamic central to Nazi compliance. Education programs, like those at Yad Vashem, use Hitler's example to teach critical thinking and moral courage, countering the psychological mechanisms that enabled his rise. This social impact underscores the need to address humanity's susceptibility to evil to safeguard against future tyrants. Globally, the fascination with Hitler shapes cultural and political discourse, from debates about free speech to policies against hate symbols. The swastika's enduring shock value, even in non-Nazi contexts, reflects his psychological grip on collective memory. However, this fascination risks trivialization, as seen in internet memes or casual references to Hitler in hyperbole, diluting the gravity of his crimes. This tension between engagement and trivialization mirrors ancient warnings, like Aristotle's call for moderation in Nicomachean Ethics, where excess distorts virtue. Hitler's psychological legacy thus demands careful navigation to honor history's lessons without sensationalizing evil. Ultimately, the psychological fascination with Hitler's evil is a cornerstone of his profound global impact, rooted in humanity's need to confront its darker impulses. His persona, blending charisma and cruelty, connects to a 2,000-year tradition of exploring malevolence, from mythic monsters to philosophical inquiries. Psychological theories, from Jung's shadow to Arendt's banality of evil, illuminate why Hitler captivates, while cultural and social responses highlight the challenge of balancing memory with prevention. As we probe this fascination, Hitler's legacy urges us to cultivate self-awareness and moral resilience, ensuring that the allure of evil does not blind us to its consequences in a world still vulnerable to division and hate. Adolf Hitler's legacy, marked by the catastrophic events of World War II and the Holocaust, serves as a profound catalyst for philosophical reflection on morality, power, and human nature, contributing significantly to his enduring global impact. His actions, driven by a toxic blend of anti-Semitic ideology and authoritarian ambition, challenge humanity to confront the ethical failures that enabled such atrocities and to draw lessons for preventing future tyrannies. Over 2,000 years, from Socratic inquiries into justice to existentialist debates on responsibility, philosophers have grappled with the dangers of unchecked power and moral relativism, and Hitler's legacy provides a stark case study. This section explores how his historical and mythic presence informs philosophical discourse, offering timeless lessons that resonate in modern struggles against oppression and division. Philosophically, Hitler's rise and reign highlight the dangers of moral absolutism and the misuse of power, echoing ancient Greek concerns. In Plato's The Republic, Socrates warns that tyranny arises when leaders prioritize personal ambition over justice, manipulating the masses through fear and flattery. Hitler's ascent, exploiting Weimar Germany's crises with promises of national renewal, exemplifies this, as his Führer cult replaced reasoned debate with blind loyalty. His distortion of Friedrich Nietzsche's will to power, misappropriated to justify Aryan supremacy, underscores the peril of philosophical ideas divorced from ethical constraints. Nietzsche's concept, intended to describe individual self-overcoming, was twisted by Nazi propaganda to glorify domination, illustrating how intellectual frameworks can be weaponized. These ancient and modern insights frame Hitler as a cautionary figure against absolutist ideologies, urging critical scrutiny of power's moral foundations. The Holocaust, orchestrated under Hitler's command, raises existential questions about human nature and moral responsibility, connecting to a 2,000-year tradition of ethical inquiry. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics posits that virtue is cultivated through deliberate choice, yet the complicity of millions in Nazi atrocities soldiers, bureaucrats, and civilians suggests a collective failure of moral agency. Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil, articulated in Eichmann in Jerusalem, 1963, argues that many perpetrators, like Adolf Eichmann, acted not from malice but from thoughtless obedience, implicating societal structures in Hitler's crimes. This aligns with Stoic teachings, such as Seneca's emphasis on rational self-governance to resist tyranny, which were absent in the Nazi era's fervor. The Holocaust's philosophical legacy thus challenges assumptions about innate goodness, urging individuals to cultivate moral courage against systemic evil. Hitler's propaganda, as explored in Section 4, prompts reflection on truth and manipulation, resonating with Socratic calls for self-examination. In Apology, Socrates argues that an unexamined life enables folly, a principle violated by the millions swayed by Goebbels' big lie tactics. The Nazi regime's control of media and iconography, from swastikas to Triumph of the Will, suppressed critical inquiry, creating a mythic Führer that obscured reality. Modern philosophers like Jürgen Habermas, advocating for communicative rationality, emphasize transparent discourse to counter such manipulation, a lesson rooted in Hitler's distortion of truth. This philosophical tension between propaganda's seductive narratives and reason's demand for clarity underscores why Hitler's legacy fuels debates about truth's role in sustaining moral societies. Existentialist philosophy, emerging in the shadow of Nazism, offers further insights into Hitler's impact. Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness, 1943, stresses individual freedom and responsibility, arguing that humans create meaning through choices, even in oppressive contexts. The complicity of ordinary Germans in Hitler's regime, from enabling the Holocaust to supporting war efforts, reflects a refusal to confront this responsibility, choosing conformity over resistance. Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, 1942, explores absurdity in the face of evil, suggesting that rebellion against tyranny like the Allied resistance or Jewish uprisings in Ghetto Saffam's Human Dignity, Hitler's legacy, as a symbol of existential despair, thus inspires philosophical calls to resist nihilism and assert moral agency, connecting to ancient Stoic resilience against adversity. Culturally, Hitler's philosophical legacy is embedded in narratives that probe morality and power, as discussed in Section 5. Works like George Orwell's 1984 draw parallels to Nazi totalitarianism, warning of surveillance and ideological control, while Bertolt Brecht's The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui critiques the societal failures that enabled Hitler. These narratives, rooted in a 2,000-year tradition of cautionary tales from Greek tragedies like Antigone, where defiance challenges tyranny, to biblical parables of moral reckoning frame Hitler as a philosophical archetype. Yet, extremist myths, falsely portraying him as a visionary leader, distort these lessons, highlighting the challenge of preserving ethical clarity amidst competing narratives. Psychologically, Hitler's legacy raises questions about collective guilt and moral complicity, aligning with Freud's exploration of the superego's role in regulating morality. Germany's post-war Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, reflects a societal effort to process guilt, evident in memorials like Berlin's Holocaust Memorial. This introspection connects to ancient Confucian teachings on rectifying errors to restore harmony, suggesting that acknowledging complicity is essential for moral renewal. The global fascination with Hitler, as explored in Section 6, stems from a need to understand how ordinary individuals enabled his atrocities, prompting philosophical reflection on the balance between individual and collective responsibility. Globally, Hitler's philosophical lessons inform modern ethical frameworks and policies. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, born from the Holocaust's moral outrage, reflects Enlightenment ideals of universal dignity, tempered by the reality of Hitler's violations. International tribunals, from Nuremberg to the International Criminal Court, embody Kantian principles of justice, holding leaders accountable for crimes against humanity. Yet, the persistence of authoritarianism and genocide, from Cambodia to Rwanda, reveals the difficulty of applying these lessons universally. Hitler's legacy thus serves as a philosophical warning, urging global commitment to ethical vigilance and institutional safeguards against tyranny. Socially, the philosophical reflections on Hitler's legacy shape efforts to combat extremism and division. Educational programs, like those at Yad Vashem, draw on Socratic inquiry to foster critical thinking, countering the ideological fanaticism that fueled Nazism. Debates about free speech versus hate speech, particularly regarding Nazi symbols, reflect Mill's utilitarian concern for balancing liberty with harm prevention. These social responses, grounded in philosophical principles, highlight Hitler's role as a catalyst for redefining moral boundaries, in a world still grappling with prejudice and power abuses. Ultimately, Hitler's legacy offers profound philosophical lessons on morality and power, connecting to a 2,000-year tradition of ethical inquiry. His actions, from the Holocaust to totalitarian rule, challenge assumptions about human nature, truth, and responsibility, echoing Socratic, Stoic, and existentialist teachings. The tension between historical truth and mythic distortions, Hitler as tyrant versus extremist icon, fuels ongoing debates about ethical clarity. As a philosophical cautionary tale, his legacy urges humanity to cultivate critical reason, moral courage, and collective accountability, ensuring that the lessons of his era guide us toward a just future in a world vulnerable to the shadows of power. Adolf Hitler's initiation of World War II and the catastrophic policies of his Nazi regime triggered geopolitical transformations that redrew the global map, profoundly shaping his enduring impact on the world. From 1939 to 1945, his aggressive expansionism and ideological fanaticism led to a conflict that dismantled empires, birthed superpowers, and established new international institutions, fundamentally altering global power dynamics. The war's aftermath, driven by the consequences of Hitler's actions, accelerated decolonization, ignited the Cold War, and laid the foundation for modern global governance. Over 2,000 years, from ancient conquests to modern nation-states, leaders have reshaped geopolitical landscapes, but Hitler's legacy stands out for its scale and unintended consequences, cementing his historical and mythic role as a catalyst for a redrawn world. The immediate geopolitical impact of Hitler's war was the collapse of European dominance. His invasions, beginning with Poland in 1939 and expanding across Europe and beyond, stretched Axis powers to their limits while devastating Allied nations like Britain and France. By 1945, Europe lay in ruins, with cities like Berlin, London, and Warsaw reduced to rubble and economies crippled. Britain and France, though victorious, were financially and militarily exhausted, unable to sustain their vast colonial empires. Hitler's war, by weakening these powers, inadvertently accelerated decolonization. In Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, independence movements gained momentum, leading to nations like India, 1947, Indonesia, 1949, and Algeria, 1962, breaking free. This shift, a direct consequence of the war's toll, marked the end of centuries of European imperialism, reshaping global power structures. The rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers was another transformative outcome of Hitler's actions. The US, entering the war after Japan's 1941 Pearl Harbor attack, emerged with a robust economy and unmatched military might, bolstered by the Manhattan Project's nuclear arsenal. The Soviet Union, despite staggering losses from Hitler's 1941 invasion, Operation Barbarossa, gained territorial influence over Eastern Europe, establishing a communist sphere. Hitler's strategic blunders, from underestimating Soviet resilience to declaring war on the US, hastened Germany's defeat and elevated these two powers. Their rivalry defined the Cold War, 1947–1991, a bipolar struggle that shaped global alliances, conflicts, and ideologies. Hitler's war, by creating this power vacuum, thus indirectly framed the 20th century's geopolitical landscape. The establishment of international institutions to prevent future global conflicts was a direct response to Hitler's devastation. The United Nations, founded in 1945, aimed to foster cooperation and peacekeeping, replacing the ineffective League of Nations. Its charter, influenced by the war's horrors and the Holocaust, emphasized human rights and collective security, ideals crystallized in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Nuremberg trials, 1945-1946, prosecuting Nazi leaders for war crimes, set a precedent for international justice, influencing later tribunals for Rwanda and Yugoslavia. These institutions, born from the need to address Hitler's atrocities, reflect his unintended legacy in shaping modern global governance, a response to the chaos he unleashed. Culturally, the geopolitical transformations fueled narratives that mythologized Hitler's role in history, connecting to a 2,000-year tradition of storytelling about conquest and collapse. Mainstream histories portray his defeat as a triumph of democracy and morality, echoing epic tales like the Iliad, where hubristic leaders fall. Films like Saving Private Ryan, 1998, and series like The World at War, 1973, reinforce this narrative, framing the Allied victory as a moral crusade against Hitler's tyranny. Yet, extremist myths, perpetuated by neo-Nazis, falsely cast him as a visionary thwarted by global conspiracies, distorting his role in the war's outcomes. These competing narratives highlight Hitler's legacy as a geopolitical disruptor, whose actions inspired both redemptive stories and dangerous distortions. Psychologically, the redrawn world prompted collective reflection on power and responsibility. The war's devastation, from Hiroshima's atomic bombing to Europe's ruins, forced humanity to confront the consequences of unchecked ambition, resonating with Freud's concept of the death drive, where destructive impulses threaten civilization. The emergence of superpowers and nuclear arsenals heightened existential fears, a legacy of Hitler's war that pushed the world toward brinkmanship. This psychological weight, coupled with guilt over colonial legacies and Holocaust complicity, aligns with ancient Stoic calls for self-mastery, as articulated by Marcus Aurelius, to navigate power's perils. Hitler's geopolitical impact thus fuels introspection about humanity's capacity to wield global influence responsibly. Philosophically, the transformations raise questions about sovereignty, justice, and human nature, connecting to a 2,000-year ethical tradition. Hobbes's Leviathan, 1651, argues for strong governance to prevent chaos, a principle tested by the war's anarchy and answered by the UN's collective framework. Kant's vision of perpetual peace through international cooperation finds echo in post-war institutions, though their imperfections reflect the difficulty of transcending national interests. Existentialists like Sartre, writing post-war, emphasized individual and collective responsibility in shaping a just world, a response to the moral failures of Hitler's era. His legacy, as a catalyst for these shifts, underscores the philosophical challenge of balancing power with ethics in a fragmented world. Socially, the geopolitical changes reshaped global identities and conflicts. Decolonization empowered new nations but left legacies of instability. From partition violence in India to civil wars in Africa, indirectly tied to Hitler's disruption of colonial powers. The Cold War's ideological divide fueled proxy conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam, while NATO and the Warsaw Pact solidified military alliances born from Hitler's war. Social movements, like civil rights in the US, drew inspiration from anti-fascist struggles, linking Hitler's defeat to broader quests for equality. Yet, the persistence of nationalism and xenophobia, often invoking Nazi rhetoric, reveals the ongoing challenge of applying these geopolitical lessons, making Hitler's legacy a social touchstone. Globally, the redrawn world informs modern diplomacy and conflict prevention. The UN's peacekeeping missions and human rights advocacy reflect efforts to avoid another Hitler-like catastrophe, though failures in Bosnia or Syria highlight limitations. Nuclear non-proliferation treaties, spurred by the war's atomic legacy, aim to curb the destructive power unleashed in 1945. The European Union, founded to unify a continent scarred by Hitler's wars, embodies a commitment to integration, though Brexit and populist surges test this vision. These global responses, rooted in the war's transformations, underscore Hitler's role as an unintended architect of modern internationalism. Ultimately, Hitler's geopolitical transformations dismantling empires, birthing superpowers, and fostering global institutions cement his profound impact on a redrawn world. His actions, from sparking World War II to enabling decolonization and the Cold War, connect to a 2,000-year tradition of leaders reshaping history, from Alexander to Caesar. The tension between historical truth and myths Hitler, as chaos maker versus extremist icon, fuels ongoing debates about power's legacy. As a catalyst for global change, his legacy urges humanity to navigate the complexities of sovereignty, justice, and cooperation, ensuring the lessons of a redrawn world guide us towards stability in an era still shaped by his shadow. Though Adolf Hitler died in 1945 and the Nazi regime was defeated, the ideology he championed has proven disturbingly resilient. From the ashes of World War II, a modern form of hatred emerged, drawing directly from his vision of racial purity, authoritarian control, and militarized nationalism. Neo-Nazis' extremist ideology echoing the beliefs and aesthetics of Nazi Germany has not only survived, but, in some cases, thrived, adapting to different social, cultural, and political climates over the decades. This section explores how Hitler's legacy persists in the modern world, how his myth continues to animate far-right extremism, and why these developments remain deeply concerning in a supposedly enlightened age. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the Allies attempted to purge Nazi ideology from German society through a process known as denazification. However, ideology is not so easily uprooted. Beneath the surface of post-war recovery, sympathizers remain some quietly resentful of Germany's defeat, others outright defiant. In the divided climate of Cold War Europe, these seeds of resentment found fertile ground. West Germany saw the rise of fringe groups nostalgically clinging to the belief that Hitler had been misunderstood or betrayed. East Germany, though officially anti-fascist, often downplayed its own complicity and blamed fascism solely on the West, allowing elements of nationalist ideology to persist in silence. By the 1960s and 70s, neo-Nazi groups began reappearing more visibly not only in Germany but in the United States, Britain, and beyond. These movements used Hitler's speeches, symbols, and Mein Kampf as a foundation for their propaganda, rebranding themselves as defenders of traditional values or white identity. Figures like George Lincoln Rockwell, founder of the American Nazi Party, openly celebrated Hitler, presenting him not as a war criminal but as a visionary. Rockwell's rhetoric and imagery mirrored Hitler's almost exactly, aiming to recast the Führer as a hero for disaffected whites in post-civil rights America. This rebranding gained further traction in the 1990s and early 2000s with the emergence of white supremacist skinhead gangs, ultra-nationalist political parties in Europe, and militia movements in North America. Many of these groups adapted Nazi iconography such as the swastika, the SS bolts, and the slogan "blood and soil" to their contexts. Holocaust denial became a common strategy among them, as they sought to sanitize Hitler's image and downplay his atrocities. Books, music, and online forums emerged to spread revisionist history and indoctrinate younger generations. The digital age has brought with it a dangerous evolution. The internet, and particularly social media platforms, have amplified extremist ideologies in ways previously unimaginable. What once required secret meetings and underground newsletters can now be achieved through viral memes, encrypted chat groups, and algorithm-driven recommendation systems. Hitler's speeches are shared in stylized videos, his image remixed into propaganda art, and his quotes adapted to suit contemporary grievances. Online radicalization pipeline, especially among young, disillusioned Menov, made it easier than ever for neo-Nazi rhetoric to spread beneath the radar. One of the most alarming aspects of this modern extremism is how seamlessly it co-opts the myths and imagery surrounding Hitler. In certain corners of the internet, Hitler is not presented as a dictator who led the world into war and orchestrated genocide, but as a misunderstood leader, a martyr for white civilization, or even a symbol of strength against perceived globalist threats. This mythologizing echoes earlier fascist propaganda that framed Hitler as a messianic figuresaint to cleanse a corrupt world and restore national pride. In today's online forums, this cult of personality persists, often combined with conspiracy theories like Holocaust denial, anti-Semitic tropes, or pseudo-scientific racial hierarchies. These distortions are not limited to obscure forums. In recent years, far-right populist movements across Europe and the United States have echoed language and themes strikingly similar to early Nazi rhetoric talk of invasions by immigrants, purity of national identity, disdain for liberal democracy, and belief in a great replacement of white populations. While not all these movements identify with Hitler directly, they draw from the same ideological well. Events like the Charlottesville rally in 2017, where neo-Nazi groups openly chanted "Jews will not replace us" and carried swastikas, are chilling reminders of how close these groups remain to their Nazi forebears. Governments and civil society have responded with a mix of vigilance and fragility. In Germany, laws strictly prohibit Nazi symbols and Holocaust denial. Educational programs about the Holocaust and Nazism are mandatory. Museums, memorials, and survivor testimonies serve as a cultural bulwark against forgetting. Yet, even in Germany, far-right parties like the Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, have gained ground, occasionally flirting with revisionist narratives and nationalist rhetoric. In other countries, especially where historical memory is less centralized or more contested, neo-Nazism festers more freely. In the US, for example, First Amendment protections often make it legally difficult to ban hate speech outright, allowing neo-Nazi propaganda to flourish under the guise of free expression. To combat this ideological persistence, numerous counter-efforts have been launched worldwide. These include grassroots de-radicalization programs, online monitoring efforts, and initiatives that pair former extremists with at-risk youth. Education remains one of the most powerful tools. Studies show that in-depth understanding of Nazi atrocities, combined with emotional engagement through survivor testimonies, reduces susceptibility to extremist narratives. But these efforts must evolve alongside the movements they combat. Neo-Nazism today is highly adaptive, meme-literate, and transnational, requiring responses that are just as dynamic and far-reaching. The myth of Hitler as a legendary figure is especially troubling. Among neo-Nazis, he is not remembered as a war criminal, but as a hero whose vision was tragically cut short. This myth serves a dual function. It offers adherents a simplistic sense of purpose and identity, and it allows them to cloak their own hatred in the borrowed aura of historical greatness. The contrast between this glorification and mainstream condemnation of Hitler fuels intense ideological battles. For every documentary, school program, or survivor lecture that exposes Hitler's crimes, there is a propaganda site or video that seeks to rewrite him into a misunderstood genius or victim of history. This is why understanding and actively resisting neo-Nazism remains so important. Hitler's influence has mutated rather than disappeared. His ideas, though broadly rejected, continue to inspire acts of violence, from synagogue shootings to mass murder manifestos. His image continues to be weaponized by those who seek to destabilize democratic societies and promote racial hatred. The battle against this legacy is not over, and complacency is its greatest ally. Ultimately, the persistence of neo-Nazism underscores a sobering truth, that hate, once unleashed, can outlive its originator by generations. Myths have a way of surviving facts. Hitler the man may be gone, but Hitler the symbol shaped by propaganda, myth, and digital manipulation remains very much alive in some corners of the world. As long as inequality, alienation, and misinformation persist, so too will the allure of authoritarian myths. The world must remain vigilant not only in remembering the past, but in resisting its resurrection. Adolf Hitler's legacy stands as one of the clearest warnings in modern history, a chilling reminder of how unchecked hatred, charismatic authoritarianism, and systemic propaganda can converge to plunge the world into unimaginable horror. Yet even decades after his death, the shadows of his ideology persist, making it imperative for society not only to remember but to act. The Nazi era was not merely a tragic aberration, it was the result of specific choices, conditions, and failures that could, under the right circumstances, repeat themselves. That is why his story must remain at the forefront of global education and moral consciousness, not for morbid fascination, but as a bulwark against the return of tyranny. At the heart of this warning lies the commitment to memory. Holocaust education and public memorials across the world, from the solemn gravestones of Auschwitz to the immersive exhibitions of Yad Vashem and the United States Holocaust, Memorial Musea Mare, not relics of the past but vital instruments of moral clarity. These institutions preserve the stories of millions who were silenced, and they strive to ensure that future generations do not grow up detached from the horrors that arose from silence, scapegoating, and complicity. In Germany, Holocaust education is not just encouraged, it is mandatory. Teachers and students engage in discussions that connect historical atrocities with contemporary struggles, linking the past to the present in a way that discourages denial and apathy. Interactive tools, survivor testimonies, and trips to historical sites are designed to instill empathy and a deep understanding of how ordinary people, through obedience or indifference, helped perpetuate one of the darkest regimes in human history. But remembrance alone is not enough. The power of Hitler's legacy is not just in what happened, but in how easily it can happen again. His rise was not a miraculous seizure of power, but a carefully orchestrated manipulation of fear, nationalism, and democratic loopholes. He turned division into a political weapon, scapegoated vulnerable minorities, and used mass media to reshape reality. Those tools, division, hate speech, disinformation, are still with us. In many parts of the world today, authoritarian figures exploit similar tactics, from censoring the press to stirring ethnic resentments, from undermining judicial independence to sowing mistrust in elections. The Nazi playbook did not end in 1945, it merely evolved. That is why the lessons of Hitler's rise and fall are deeply relevant to the modern world. In an age of algorithm-driven social media, where misinformation spreads faster than fact, and online radicalization fosters extremism in private echo chambers, the wolves of the 21st century no longer wear uniforms, they wear anonymity. The tactics have changed, but the danger remains the same. Neo-Nazi groups today operate transnationally, recruiting online, spreading propaganda through memes and coded language, and glorifying Hitler not as a villain, but as a misunderstood hero. These distortions of history are deliberate. They are used to cultivate identity, sow division, and justify violence. To counter this, education must do more than inform, it must equip. Critical thinking, media literacy, and civic engagement should be core components of modern education systems. Students must be taught not only what happened during the Holocaust, but also how propaganda works, how language can be weaponized, and how prejudice hides behind the mask of tradition or patriotism. In classrooms, in communities, and online, we must foster resilience to extremism not through fear, but through knowledge and critical analysis. This is not just an intellectual exercise, it's a moral imperative. The global resurgence of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-immigrant rhetoric, and authoritarian populism shows that the ideological seeds Hitler planted were never fully uprooted. Every generation must choose whether to confront these seeds or allow them to grow in silence. Silence, after all, is what allowed the Holocaust to unfold in plain sight. Millions were murdered not just by bullets and gas, but by the quiet compliance of neighbors, officials, and bystanders who chose comfort over courage. Adolf Hitler's legacy stands as one of the clearest warnings in modern history, a chilling reminder of how unchecked hatred, charismatic authoritarianism, and systemic propaganda can converge to plunge the world into unimaginable horror. Yet even decades after his death, the shadows of his ideology persist, making it imperative for society not only to remember but to act. The Nazi era was not merely a tragic aberration, it was the result of specific choices, conditions, and failures that could, under the right circumstances, repeat themselves. That is why his story must remain at the forefront of global education and moral consciousness, not for morbid fascination, but as a bulwark against the return of tyranny. At the heart of this warning lies the commitment to memory. Holocaust education and public memorials across the world, from the solemn gravestones of Auschwitz to the immersive exhibitions of Yad Vashem and the United States Holocaust, Memorial Musea Mare, not relics of the past, but vital instruments of moral clarity. These institutions preserve the stories of millions who were silenced, and they strive to ensure that future generations do not grow up detached from the horrors that arose from silence, scapegoating, and complicity. In Germany, Holocaust education is not just encouraged, it is mandatory. Teachers and students engage in discussions that connect historical atrocities with contemporary struggles, linking the past to the present in a way that discourages denial and apathy. Interactive tools, survivor testimonies, and trips to historical sites are designed to instill empathy and a deep understanding of how ordinary people, through obedience or indifference, helped perpetuate one of the darkest regimes in human history. But remembrance alone is not enough. The power of Hitler's legacy is not just in what happened, but in how easily it can happen again. His rise was not a miraculous seizure of power, but a carefully orchestrated manipulation of fear, nationalism, and democratic loopholes. He turned division into a political weapon, scapegoated vulnerable minorities, and used mass media to reshape reality. Those tools, division, hate speech, disinformation are still with us. In many parts of the world today, authoritarian figures exploit similar tactics, from censoring the press to stirring ethnic resentments, from undermining judicial independence to sowing mistrust in elections. The Nazi playbook did not end in 1945, it merely evolved. That is why the lessons of Hitler's rise and fall are deeply relevant to the modern world. In an age of algorithm-driven social media, where misinformation spreads faster than fact, and online radicalization fosters extremism in private echo chambers, the wolves of the 21st century no longer wear uniforms, they wear anonymity. The tactics have changed, but the danger remains the same. Neo-Nazi groups today operate transnationally, recruiting online, spreading propaganda through memes and coded language, and glorifying Hitler not as a villain, but as a misunderstood hero. These distortions of history are deliberate. They are used to cultivate identity, sow division, and justify violence. To counter this, education must do more than inform, it must equip. Critical thinking, media literacy, and civic engagement should be core components of modern education systems. Students must be taught not only what happened during the Holocaust, but also how propaganda works, how language can be weaponized, and how prejudice hides behind the mask of tradition or patriotism. In classrooms, in communities, and online, we must foster resilience to extremism not through fear, but through knowledge and critical analysis. This is not just an intellectual exercise, it's a moral imperative. The global resurgence of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-immigrant rhetoric, and authoritarian populism shows that the ideological seeds Hitler planted were never fully uprooted. Every generation must choose whether to confront these seeds or allow them to grow in silence. Silence, after all, is what allowed the Holocaust to unfold in plain sight. Millions were murdered not just by bullets and gas, but by the quiet compliance of neighbors, officials, and bystanders who chose comfort over courage.